Victoria Cilliers and the Parachute Murder Attempt. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. Welcome to 22 Crime, the podcast where we delve into some of the most shocking and compelling true crime stories from around the world. Today, we're exploring a case that is as chilling as it is complex, a story of love, betrayal, and survival that could easily be mistaken for the plot of a thriller, but tragically, it's all too real. It's a story that begins with what should have been a routine skydive for Victoria Cilliers, a highly skilled skydiver and mother of two. But instead of the adrenaline rush she was accustomed to, Victoria found herself in a terrifying freefall when both her main and reserve parachutes failed. Miraculously, she survived the 4,000-foot plunge, but what followed was even more shocking: a police investigation that pointed to her own husband, Emile Cilliers, as the prime suspect in a twisted plot to end her life. In this episode, we'll take you through the events leading up to that fateful jump, the dark secrets that emerged during the investigation, and the emotional and legal battles that followed. This is a case that captivated the nation, not only because of the sheer horror of the crime, but also because of the resilience and strength that Victoria showed in the face of unimaginable betrayal. So, let's dive into this incredible story, a tale where love turns into manipulation, and trust is shattered in the most terrifying way possible. This is Victoria Cilliers and the Parachute Murder Attempt. The morning of April 5, 2015, dawned with a crisp clarity, the kind of day that skydivers dream of: clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the promise of an exhilarating leap from 4,000 feet above the earth. For Victoria Cilliers, an experienced skydiver with over 2,600 jumps under her belt, this should have been just another routine dive. But as she prepared for her jump at Netheravon Airfield in Wiltshire, a gnawing unease began to take hold. Victoria had always loved the thrill of freefall, the rush of wind, and the sudden silence as the parachute deployed. But today, something was different. The excitement she usually felt was overshadowed by a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She had just given birth to her second child, Ben, only 5 weeks earlier. Her body was still recovering, and her mind was consumed with thoughts of her children: April, her nearly 3-year-old daughter, and baby Ben, who needed her more than ever. As she suited up, strapping on her parachute, Victoria couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She had debated with herself about whether she should even be there. Her husband, Emile, had encouraged her to go, reassuring her that she needed to get back to doing what she loved. His words had comforted her at the time, but now, standing on the tarmac, that comfort felt hollow. She forced herself to push aside the doubts, telling herself that she was just being overcautious. The atmosphere at the airfield was business as usual. Fellow skydivers were going through their own preparations, chatting casually as they double-checked their gear. But for Victoria, every sound seemed muted, every movement slowed. As the plane prepared to take off, she walked across the tarmac, the weight of her equipment pressing down on her shoulders, but it was nothing compared to the weight of the anxiety settling in her chest. Once on board the plane, Victoria found herself a spot among the other jumpers. The engine roared to life, and the aircraft began its ascent, climbing higher and higher into the sky. The usual chatter and banter among the skydivers did little to calm her nerves. She stared out of the window, watching as the ground fell away beneath them, feeling a growing sense of foreboding. Something wasn't right, she could feel it in her bones. The plane leveled off at 4,000 feet, the jump altitude. Victoria took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She tightened her helmet and lowered her visor, mentally running through the steps she had taken thousands of times before. But no matter how much she tried to focus, the unease wouldn't leave her. One by one, the jumpers ahead of her disappeared through the open door, swallowed by the vast expanse of blue sky. Finally, it was Victoria's turn. She shuffled to the edge of the plane, the wind howling in her ears as she looked down at the patchwork of fields far below. She hesitated, just for a second, then pushed herself off the edge. The initial rush of freefall hit her, the familiar sensation of weightlessness and speed. But as Victoria reached for the ripcord to deploy her main parachute, the nightmare began. The chute deployed, but instead of the reassuring tug that signaled a successful opening, there was a violent jolt. Looking up, Victoria's worst fears were confirmed. The canopy above her was a twisted mess of tangled lines. Her parachute had failed to open correctly. Panic surged through her as she realized the gravity of the situation. But Victoria was no stranger to skydiving mishaps. She had been trained for emergencies like this. With practiced precision, she reached for the cutaway handle, releasing the main chute in the hopes that the reserve would deploy and save her. But hope turned to horror in an instant. The reserve parachute burst out of its pack, but instead of inflating properly, it only partially opened. The lines were tangled, the canopy misshapen. Instead of slowing her descent, it sent her into a violent spin. The ground, which had seemed so distant just moments ago, was now rushing up to meet her at a terrifying speed. Victoria fought desperately to regain control, but the centrifugal force of the spin made it impossible to stabilize the chute. Her body was being whipped around mercilessly, the world around her a blur of motion. Every instinct told her to fight, to survive, but the situation was spiraling beyond her control. The thoughts of her children flashed through her mind. April's bright smile, Ben's tiny hands. She couldn't leave them, not like this. The ground loomed closer and closer. Victoria knew that at this speed, the impact would be catastrophic. She struggled to think, to act, but nothing was working. The reserve chute was useless, and her options were running out. Then, in a split second, everything went dark. A deafening metallic bang filled her ears, and Victoria's world went black as she slammed into the earth below. Victoria lay unconscious in a plowed field, her body broken and battered by the fall. Bones shattered, her pelvis fractured, and her internal organs bruised, but against all odds, she was still alive. The nightmare wasn't over, but she had survived the unimaginable. The questions of how and why this had happened would soon unravel, leading to revelations more chilling than the fall itself. For now, though, there was only darkness and the sound of approaching footsteps as first responders raced to her aid, unaware of the horrifying truth that would soon come to light. Victoria Cilliers' early life was shaped by the tranquil and stable environment of Edinburgh, where she was raised in a loving and close-knit family. Her childhood was filled with the simple joys of riding horses, exploring the Scottish countryside, and basking in the warmth of a home where love and discipline were in perfect balance. Her parents, particularly her father, instilled in her a strong sense of duty and resilience. These values would later serve as both a guiding light and a heavy burden. But the idyllic nature of Victoria's childhood was shattered when she was just 14 years old. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer, a diagnosis that sent shockwaves through the family and altered the course of Victoria's life forever. The once cheerful and carefree atmosphere of their home was replaced by a pervasive sense of dread and sadness. As her mother's condition worsened, Victoria watched helplessly as the person she loved most in the world slowly slipped away. The impact of her mother's illness was profound. Victoria, a young girl just beginning to navigate the complexities of adolescence, found herself thrust into a world of pain and uncertainty. In the face of such overwhelming grief, she turned to the few things that offered her solace: the structure of school activities, the discipline of the Army cadets, and the loud, cathartic rhythms of heavy metal music. She became more reserved, channeling her energy into anything that could distract her from the emotional turmoil at home. Joining the Army cadets was a pivotal decision for Victoria. It provided her with a sense of purpose and a way to escape the suffocating grief that hung over her family. The cadets gave her a taste of the military life, a life defined by order, camaraderie, and adventure. It was here that she began to contemplate a future in the armed forces, driven by a desire to find something that would fill the void left by her mother's illness and eventual death. The loss of her mother was a turning point, leaving Victoria with an unshakable determination to push herself beyond the ordinary. She sought out challenges that would allow her to escape the pain and forge a new identity. This drive, born out of grief, led her to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, a decision that would change her life in ways she could never have anticipated. Victoria's time at Sandhurst was marked by intense physical and mental challenges. The transition from civilian life to the rigorous demands of military training was brutal, but it was exactly what she needed. The grueling days, filled with endless drills, sleep deprivation, and constant assessments, were designed to push each cadet to their absolute limits. For Victoria, it was a test of endurance, both physically and emotionally. The discipline and structure of military life provided a stark contrast to the chaos and pain of her teenage years. At Sandhurst, Victoria found herself surrounded by like-minded individuals, people who, like her, were seeking something greater than themselves. The bonds she formed with her peers were forged in the crucible of shared hardship, and these relationships would become the foundation of her military career. After completing her training, Victoria was deployed to Kosovo, a war-torn region where the horrors of conflict were on full display. As a physiotherapist in a military hospital, Victoria was confronted with the brutal realities of war. She treated soldiers and civilians alike, many of whom had suffered devastating injuries in the crossfire of a conflict that seemed without end. But it was the children, the youngest and most innocent victims of the war, who left the deepest scars on her soul. In Kosovo, Victoria saw firsthand the toll that war takes on the human body and spirit. The conditions were primitive, the resources scarce, and the emotional strain immense. Each day brought new challenges, wounds that needed tending, lives that needed saving, and a sense of hopelessness that was impossible to escape. The experience left Victoria struggling to reconcile the horrors she witnessed with the life she had left behind in the UK. The contrast between the brutal reality of Kosovo and the mundane concerns of her civilian life was jarring, leaving her feeling disconnected and adrift. Upon returning to the UK, Victoria faced a new battle, the struggle to reintegrate into a world that seemed oblivious to the suffering she had witnessed. The trivial complaints of those around her felt absurd and disconnected from the harsh realities of war. This sense of dislocation only deepened her isolation and anger. She was haunted by the memories of Kosovo, unable to fully process the trauma she had experienced. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, Victoria found herself searching for something that could bring her back to life, something that would help her reconnect with the person she had been before the war. That something turned out to be skydiving. Encouraged by a colleague to try adventure training, Victoria decided to give skydiving another shot. She had tried it once before, during a charity jump as a teenager, but the experience had been underwhelming, marred by bad weather and frustration. This time, however, she was determined to push herself further. At first, her return to skydiving was met with the same frustrations, static line jumps that felt restrictive and disappointing. But then she was offered the chance to try accelerated freefall skydiving, and everything changed. The moment Victoria stepped out of the plane and into the void, she felt a rush of adrenaline like never before. The sheer exhilaration of freefall, the feeling of complete freedom as she plummeted toward the earth, was intoxicating. For the first time in years, Victoria felt alive. The sky became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the pain and trauma of the past and focus solely on the present moment. Skydiving quickly became more than just a hobby for Victoria. It became a passion, a way of life. She immersed herself in the skydiving community, spending every spare moment at the parachute center, honing her skills and pushing herself to new heights. The sport offered her a sense of control and liberation that she couldn't find elsewhere. It was a way to reclaim her identity, to prove to herself that she was more than the sum of her past experiences. But as with any adventure, the thrill of skydiving came with its own set of risks that Victoria was more than willing to take. Little did she know, these risks would soon lead her down a path that would test her in ways she had never imagined, a path that would bring her to the edge of death itself. When Victoria Cilliers first met Emile, there was little in his demeanor to suggest the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. He was a British Army sergeant, a man who exuded confidence and charm, and had become one of her patients at the military hospital where she worked as a physiotherapist. Their initial interactions were professional, but there was an undeniable spark between them, one that quickly blossomed into something more. Emile was captivating. He had a way of making Victoria feel seen and understood, which was something she desperately needed after the emotional scars left by her previous relationships. Emile, with his South African accent and tales of adventure, seemed like the perfect match for Victoria, who was still reeling from the heartache of her previous marriage. They bonded over their shared love for adventure sports, particularly skydiving, which Emile eagerly embraced, matching Victoria's passion for the thrill of the jump. The relationship progressed rapidly. Emile's affection for Victoria was intense and all-consuming. He seemed eager to merge their lives together, moving into her home after just a few months of dating. To Victoria, it felt like a whirlwind romance, a chance to start anew with someone who shared her interests and seemed genuinely committed to building a life together. But as with many whirlwind romances, the speed with which their relationship developed left little room for critical reflection. Beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect relationship, however, there were early signs that not everything was as it seemed. Emile often spoke dismissively of his ex-wife Carly and their tumultuous relationship. While Victoria initially saw this as Emile being open about his past, the bitterness with which he described Carly began to unsettle her. It was as if he harbored a deep-seated resentment that went beyond the normal frustrations of a failed marriage. As their relationship deepened, Emile's financial troubles started to come to light. He admitted to Victoria that he was in significant debt, which he attributed to Carly's spending habits during their marriage. Victoria, empathetic and eager to help, offered to assist him in clearing his debts. They opened a joint bank account and began to plan their future together, but Emile's financial issues were far from over. Small, unexplained withdrawals from their account became a recurring issue, which Emile always had an excuse for. Victoria's unease grew, but she pushed it aside, rationalizing that everyone makes mistakes and that she could help him get back on track. However, it wasn't just the financial troubles that began to raise red flags for Victoria. A chance conversation with Carly, Emile's ex-wife, unearthed a shocking revelation. Emile had been married before her to a woman in South Africa and had children from that marriage. Victoria was blindsided by this revelation. Emile had never mentioned a previous marriage, let alone children. This wasn't just a lie of omission, it was a deliberate concealment of a significant part of his life. When she confronted Emile, he was evasive, dismissing her concerns as unnecessary worries. He claimed that his past was behind him and irrelevant to their future. But this wasn't the first time Emile had sidestepped difficult questions, and Victoria couldn't help but feel that this pattern of avoidance was a sign of deeper issues in their relationship. As their relationship progressed, Emile's behavior became increasingly erratic. He grew more distant, often avoiding discussions about their future and his past. Whenever Victoria tried to bring up the topic of his first wife and children, Emile would deflect, becoming defensive and shutting down the conversation. This behavior only intensified Victoria's sense of unease, deepening her suspicions that there were aspects of Emile's life that he was deliberately keeping hidden from her. As the months went by, Victoria's unease grew into full-blown suspicion. Emile's absences became more frequent, and his explanations were often vague and unconvincing. One day, while sorting through laundry, Victoria found something that sent a chill down her spine, a receipt from a local sex club, hidden among Emile's belongings. The realization that Emile had been frequenting such places behind her back shattered any remaining trust she had in him. Victoria confronted Emile, demanding an explanation, but once again, he deflected. He claimed it was just a one-time mistake, something that happened in a moment of weakness. But the receipt suggested otherwise, and deep down, Victoria knew this was no isolated incident. The man she thought she knew was leading a double life, one that included not just infidelity, but a secret world of sexual exploits that he had kept hidden from her. This discovery, coupled with the earlier revelation about his previous marriage and children, left Victoria feeling completely betrayed. The image of the man she had married was crumbling before her eyes, revealing a darker, more sinister side that she had never imagined. But these were not isolated incidents. Emile's behavior grew increasingly secretive, and his explanations became less convincing. Victoria discovered that he had taken out loans and overdrafts in her name without her consent. When she confronted him, their arguments escalated, and Emile would become defensive and aggressive, turning the blame back on her. He had a way of making her doubt her own instincts, leaving her feeling confused and isolated. Despite these red flags, Victoria found herself trapped in a cycle of hope and despair. She believed that they were going through a rough patch, that things would eventually improve, and that Emile's financial mismanagement was something they could overcome together. But with each new discovery, each lie, each act of deception, Victoria's trust in Emile eroded further, leaving her questioning the very foundation of their relationship, marriage, and further complications. Despite the growing doubts that plagued her, Victoria married Emile in an intimate ceremony in South Africa, surrounded by family and friends. The setting was beautiful, and for a brief moment, Victoria allowed herself to believe in the fairy tale. Emile's romantic proposal, during which he cleverly hid a ring on a cheetah's collar at a sanctuary, had filled her with hope for their future. But the marriage, like their relationship, was fraught with complications from the very beginning. Shortly after their wedding, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. But what should have been a joyous time was overshadowed by heartbreak. Victoria suffered a miscarriage, a devastating loss that left her emotionally shattered. Instead of providing the comfort and support she desperately needed, Emile's reaction was shockingly cold. Rather than staying by her side, he chose to attend a cricket match in London, a decision that revealed a troubling lack of empathy and concern for his wife's well-being. This insensitivity was a harbinger of the challenges to come. Victoria soon became pregnant again, but this time, the pregnancy was fraught with complications. She spent much of it in and out of the hospital, battling fears of another miscarriage while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her life. Emile was present during the birth of their daughter, April, but his behavior remained inconsistent, sometimes supportive, other times distant and preoccupied. As Victoria struggled with the physical and emotional demands of motherhood, Emile's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His financial mismanagement escalated, and Victoria found herself constantly stressed about money. Emile was also unfaithful, engaging in multiple affairs, including a particularly intense relationship with Stephanie Galler, a woman he met on Tinder. Victoria's discovery of his infidelity was devastating, but Emile dismissed her concerns, gaslighting her into believing that she was overreacting or imagining things. Despite the emotional turmoil, Victoria clung to the hope that they could work through their problems. She threw herself into her role as a mother, trying to create a stable environment for her children. But the emotional distance between her and Emile continued to grow, leaving her feeling increasingly isolated and alone. The birth of their second child, Ben, should have been a time of joy and renewal for their marriage, but it only added to the strain. Emile was often absent, either physically or emotionally, leaving Victoria to manage the demands of motherhood on her own. The love and warmth that had once defined their relationship were replaced by tension, resentment, and a growing sense of dread. As Victoria grappled with the reality of her marriage, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about Emile. The man she had fallen in love with, the man she had married, was becoming a stranger, someone she could no longer trust. The warning signs were there, but Victoria, desperate to hold her family together, continued to ignore them, hoping against hope that things would somehow improve. But the cracks in their marriage were becoming impossible to ignore, and the events that were about to unfold would force Victoria to confront the terrifying truth about the man she had married, a truth that would shatter her world and leave her fighting for her life. As New Year's Eve approached, the festive spirit that usually marked the end of the year was notably absent in Victoria Cilliers' life. She was alone, heavily pregnant, and struggling with the demands of caring for their 2-year-old daughter, April. The house, usually filled with the comforting sounds of a family, felt cold and empty. Emile, her husband, was nowhere to be found. Emile had claimed that he was working at a military base, but Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. His absence had become more frequent, and when he was home, he was distant, cold even. The warmth that once characterized their relationship had all but vanished, replaced by a sense of foreboding that gnawed at Victoria's peace of mind. As the night wore on, Victoria found herself surrounded by friends, trying to muster some semblance of normalcy. Yet, even in the company of others, she felt isolated. The joy and laughter that filled the room only served to highlight her deepening loneliness. Emile's silence on New Year's Eve, a night they should have spent together, was deafening. When she finally returned home, her heart heavy with despair, she was greeted only by the echoing silence of the empty house. Victoria's thoughts raced as she lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. Her mind wandered to Emile's recent behavior, the unexplained absences, the secretive phone calls, the mounting financial problems he brushed off with vague excuses. She had begun to suspect that he was hiding something from her, but the truth was elusive, slipping through her fingers like sand. The next morning, as the first day of the new year dawned, Victoria received a bland, emotionless text from Emile. "Happy New Year." The words, so hollow and devoid of warmth, confirmed what she already feared, that the man she had once loved deeply was no longer present in their marriage. But as unsettling as that realization was, it paled in comparison to what would happen next. It was a quiet morning when Victoria noticed something odd, a strange smell in the kitchen that she couldn't quite place. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the lingering scent of last night's dinner. But as she went about her morning routine, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It wasn't until she was directly in front of the stove that she recognized the scent for what it was: gas. Panic gripped her as she frantically checked the stove, but all the knobs were turned off. The smell, however, persisted. It wasn't coming from the stove, but from somewhere deeper, more insidious. Following her instincts, Victoria traced the scent to a gas pipe running along the kitchen wall. As she inspected the pipe more closely, her blood ran cold. A bolt had been loosened, causing gas to leak into the room. Victoria's heart raced. She was alone in the house with her young daughter and a baby on the way. The realization of how close they had come to disaster left her breathless. How long had the gas been leaking? What if she hadn't noticed in time? The questions whirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. When Emile finally returned home, Victoria confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "Did you try to kill us?" she asked, half joking, half serious, hoping for some reassurance. But Emile's reaction was anything but comforting. Instead of laughing it off or expressing concern, he became defensive, dismissive even. His response was laced with irritation, as if her question had offended him deeply. "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped, brushing off her concerns with a wave of his hand. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The bolt had not just come loose on its own, someone had tampered with it. And Emile's reaction, so disproportionate to the situation, only fueled her growing suspicion. As the days passed, Victoria's unease deepened. The gas leak incident haunted her, playing over and over in her mind. She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself that it was just an accident, but the doubt gnawed at her. What if it wasn't an accident? What if Emile had deliberately tampered with the gas line, intending to harm her and their children? The idea seemed ludicrous at first. After all, this was the man she had married, the father of her children. But as she replayed the events in her mind, the pieces began to fit together in a way that made her stomach churn. The financial troubles, the infidelity, the growing distance between them. Had Emile reached a point where he wanted out of their marriage so badly that he was willing to kill for it? Victoria's mind raced with the implications. If Emile had tampered with the gas line, what else was he capable of? The thought that she and her children might not be safe in their own home was too much to bear. She felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of her suspicions and the fear that had taken root in her heart. But what could she do? She had no proof, no concrete evidence that Emile had done anything wrong. And yet, the fear lingered, a constant presence in the back of her mind, making her jump at every creak of the house, every unexpected noise. The once warm and comforting home she had built with Emile now felt like a prison, each corner hiding a potential threat. The gas leak incident marked a turning point for Victoria. The fear that had been gnawing at her for months now became a constant companion, casting a dark shadow over every aspect of her life. She found herself withdrawing, pulling away from friends and family as the weight of her suspicions became too heavy to share. How could she explain her fears without sounding paranoid? How could she tell them that she suspected her husband might want to kill her? Emile, for his part, continued to act as though nothing was wrong. He dismissed the gas leak as a minor issue, something easily fixed, and carried on with his life as if the incident had never happened. But Victoria saw the truth in his eyes, the cold, calculating distance that had replaced the warmth he once showed her. She began to see Emile not as the man she had fallen in love with, but as a stranger, someone she could no longer trust. The emotional toll of living with someone she suspected might harm her was immense. Victoria's anxiety grew, manifesting in sleepless nights and constant vigilance. She found herself checking the gas line repeatedly, ensuring that every window and door was locked tight before going to bed, and jumping at the slightest noise. Her once vibrant spirit was now dulled by the ever-present fear that something terrible was about to happen. The isolation was the hardest part. Victoria felt as though she was living a double life, outwardly maintaining the appearance of a happy family, while inwardly grappling with the terrifying possibility that her husband was a threat. She became hypervigilant, analyzing every word, every action, searching for clues that might confirm her worst fears. The mental and emotional strain left her exhausted, but she couldn't let her guard down, not even for a moment. As the days turned into weeks, the fear began to take on a life of its own, growing into a dark, suffocating presence that threatened to consume her. Victoria knew that she couldn't continue living like this, but the question of what to do next loomed large. How could she protect herself and her children when the danger might be lurking within her own home? The gas leak had been a wake-up call, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare that was about to unfold. April 5, 2015, began as a day full of hope and reconciliation for Victoria Cilliers. The crisp spring air carried a hint of the warmth to come, and the sky above Netheravon Airfield in Wiltshire was a clear, inviting blue. It was Easter Sunday, a day that usually signified new beginnings and rebirth, a fitting backdrop, Victoria thought, for the day she hoped would rekindle the connection between her and her husband Emile. For Victoria, skydiving had always been more than just a hobby. It was a passion, a way to feel alive and connected to the world in a way that nothing else could offer. The thrill of freefall, the peace in the quiet moments before landing, these were things she had missed dearly over the past year. Pregnancy and the responsibilities of being a new mother had kept her grounded, and she was eager to take to the skies again, but today was special for another reason. Emile had arranged this jump for her, a gesture that touched her deeply. It was a sign, she hoped, that he wanted to mend their strained marriage, that he was willing to put effort into their relationship again. However, things did not go as smoothly as planned. On the day before, when they had initially intended to make the jump, Emile and Victoria faced an unexpected problem. They couldn't find a babysitter for their children, April and Ben. Emile, ever the problem solver, quickly suggested that he would handle the babysitting duties himself. "You go ahead and jump," he told Victoria. "I'll look after the kids. We can't miss this chance just because of a little hiccup." Victoria was touched by his willingness to stay behind. It felt like a caring gesture, a sign that he wanted her to enjoy herself, to take some time to reconnect with something she loved. But as they arrived at the airfield, another issue arose. The weather had turned poor, with thick clouds and gusty winds making it impossible to jump. Disappointed but undeterred, Victoria agreed when Emile suggested they return the next day. On that Sunday, April 5th, the weather had cleared up, but it was still far from ideal for skydiving. The wind was unpredictable, and the clouds hung low, forcing the jump organizers to lower the altitude of the dive to just 4,000 feet, far below the usual height of 13,000 feet. Victoria, however, was undeterred. The skydiving community was like a second family to her, and she felt a sense of belonging as she suited up and prepared for the jump. The previous day's small setbacks, the babysitter issue, the weather delay, seemed inconsequential now. Emile had been supportive throughout, even helping with her parachute gear, carrying it with him when their daughter needed to use the restroom. At the time, it seemed like a sweet, considerate gesture, a husband taking care of his wife, making sure everything was just right. But as Victoria would later realize, it was in that small, seemingly innocent act that the seeds of her near-death experience were sown. As she prepared for the jump, Victoria was excited but nervous, an odd feeling for someone who had completed over 2,600 jumps in her lifetime. She chalked it up to the time she had spent away from the sport. It had been over a year since she last jumped, and a lot had changed in her life since then. As she sat in the small aircraft, waiting for her turn to jump, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She felt tired, more tired than she should have, considering how much she had looked forward to this day. But she pushed the feelings aside, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, Emile had gone through all this trouble to set up the jump. She owed it to him, to herself, to go through with it. The plane began its ascent, and Victoria's nerves settled into a familiar rhythm as she mentally ran through the steps of the jump. She adjusted her harness, checked her altimeter, and mentally rehearsed the motions she had performed countless times before. The plane leveled off at 4,000 feet, and one by one the other jumpers exited, disappearing into the blue sky. When it was finally her turn, Victoria hesitated for just a moment at the door. The wind whipped around her, loud and insistent, as she looked out at the patchwork of fields below. She felt a flicker of fear, unusual for her, but then she reminded herself of how much she loved this, how much she needed this. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself out of the plane and into the sky. The familiar rush of adrenaline hit her as she began her freefall, the air roaring past her as she descended. She reached for the ripcord, a practiced motion, and pulled. But instead of the reassuring tug of the parachute deploying, she felt a jarring, uneven jolt. Something was wrong. Victoria's instincts kicked in immediately. She looked up and saw that the lines of her main parachute were twisted, knotted together in a way that prevented the canopy from fully inflating. She was spinning out of control, the ground below her a dizzying blur. She tried to kick out the twists, a maneuver she had practiced many times before, but the lines wouldn't untangle. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that she was rapidly running out of time. At 4,000 feet, there wasn't much altitude to work with. She needed to deploy her reserve parachute, and she needed to do it fast. With practiced precision, she reached for her hook knife, a small blade designed to cut away the main parachute in case of a malfunction. Her hands were steady as she sliced through the tangled lines, freeing herself from the useless chute. With the main parachute cut away, Victoria pulled the ripcord for her reserve. She braced herself for the familiar jolt as the canopy deployed, but nothing happened. Panic surged through her as she realized that the reserve parachute wasn't deploying. She pulled again, harder this time, but still, there was nothing. The ground was coming up fast now, too fast. Victoria's training was the only thing keeping her from total panic. She tried everything she could think of, every trick she had learned in her years of skydiving, but the reserve chute remained stubbornly closed. Desperate, she glanced up to see what had gone wrong, and her blood ran cold. The reserve parachute had partially deployed, but it wasn't inflating. It was flapping uselessly above her, offering no resistance to the pull of gravity. And then she saw why. The reserve chute was only attached by one of the two slinks, the soft links that connected the parachute to the harness. The other slink was missing entirely, leaving the canopy limp and ineffective. Victoria's thoughts flashed to her children, to Ben and April, who were waiting for her on the ground, unaware of the danger their mother was in. She thought of Emile, and a dark, terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind, but there was no time to dwell on it. The ground was rushing up to meet her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As she plummeted toward the earth, spinning uncontrollably, Victoria braced herself for the impact. She knew the odds of surviving a fall from this height without a functioning parachute were slim to none. In those final moments, time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity as she prepared for what she believed would be her death. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Victoria's body slammed into the ground with bone-shattering force, but instead of the hard-packed earth or concrete that would have killed her instantly, she landed in a freshly plowed field. The soft, aerated soil absorbed much of the impact, cushioning her fall just enough to spare her life. As Victoria Cilliers lay on the freshly plowed field, the world around her seemed distant, blurred by the haze of shock and unimaginable pain. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through the nearby trees. It was a silence that enveloped her, cocooning her in a strange, surreal calm as her broken body fought to keep breathing. The last thing she remembered was the ground rushing up to meet her, a patchwork quilt of green and brown that had become a blur as she spiraled uncontrollably through the sky. Then, everything went black. When she came to, the pain was excruciating. It radiated from every part of her body, each breath a sharp, stabbing agony that stole her air and left her gasping. She couldn't move. Every attempt to shift even slightly sent waves of torment through her body, and she quickly abandoned the effort. Instead, she focused on staying conscious, on holding on to the thin thread of awareness that tethered her to life. But even that was slipping away, her vision fading in and out as the pain threatened to overwhelm her. It wasn't long before help arrived. Paramedics, trained to deal with emergencies of all kinds, were unprepared for the sight that met them. A skydiver, crumpled and broken, lying in a field where she had no business being alive. But alive she was, barely clinging to the thread of life. They worked quickly, efficiently, assessing her injuries and stabilizing her for transport to the hospital. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Victoria Cilliers had fallen 4,000 feet from the sky, her parachutes failing her at every turn, yet somehow she was still breathing. The list of injuries was long and severe. Victoria had suffered multiple fractures to her pelvis, ribs, and spine, her vertebrae shattered in 4 places. One of her lungs had collapsed, filling her chest with fluid and making every breath a battle. The internal damage was extensive, with bleeding in several critical areas that threatened her life with every passing minute. The fact that she was even conscious, let alone alive, was nothing short of a miracle. Victoria was airlifted to a nearby hospital, where a team of doctors and surgeons was already waiting. They had been briefed on her condition during the flight, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of what they faced. Victoria was in critical condition, her body on the verge of collapse from the trauma it had endured. They moved quickly, rushing her into surgery to address the most immediate threats: the collapsed lung, the internal bleeding, the fractures that needed to be stabilized. Hours passed in a blur of activity as the medical team worked tirelessly to save her life. Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind fogged by pain and medication. When she was awake, her thoughts were scattered, disjointed memories of the fall mixing with the stark reality of her injuries. She thought of her children, of April and Ben, and the thought of them waiting for her gave her the strength to keep fighting, to keep breathing even when it seemed impossible. And then there was Emile. In the brief moments of clarity that punctuated her pain, Victoria found herself thinking about her husband. Where was he? Had he been told? Surely he would be at her side, holding her hand, reassuring her that everything would be okay. But as the days passed and Victoria began the slow, agonizing process of recovery, Emile's presence was scarce and his concern almost non-existent. Emile Cilliers visited his wife in the hospital, but the man who walked into her room was not the loving husband Victoria had expected. He was distant, cold even, his eyes avoiding hers as he sat by her bed. He asked the necessary questions, how she was feeling, what the doctors had said, but there was no warmth in his voice, no real concern in his demeanor. It was as if he was going through the motions, playing a part that he had no real interest in. Victoria, weak and in pain, noticed the change immediately. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that he was just in shock, that he was struggling to cope with what had happened. But as the days turned into weeks, Emile's detachment only grew more pronounced. He would visit briefly, often sitting in silence or fiddling with his phone, barely engaging with her before leaving. He didn't stay long enough to see the tears well up in her eyes as she lay in her hospital bed, alone and frightened. The man who had once been her partner in everything, the father of her children, was now a stranger. What made it worse was what Victoria discovered one quiet afternoon while lying in her hospital bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. Emile had left his phone on the bedside table, and when it buzzed with a new message, she saw the name that flashed on the screen. Stephanie. Curiosity and a gnawing suspicion drove her to pick up the phone, her hands trembling as she unlocked it with the code she had known for years. The messages that greeted her eyes were a punch to the gut. The exchange between Emile and Stephanie was flirtatious, intimate, full of the kind of affection and care that he had denied Victoria for so long. They spoke of meeting up, of plans for the future that didn't include her. Each word felt like a betrayal, each line of text a knife twisting deeper into the wound that Emile had already inflicted. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as she read the words, her mind reeling. Here she was, lying in a hospital bed, struggling to recover from an accident that could have killed her, a fall that she now knew in her heart was no accident at all, and Emile was flirting with another woman. The realization was too much to bear, the betrayal too deep. She dropped the phone back onto the table, her hands shaking, her heart breaking all over again. Even at home, Emile's coldness persisted. He made no effort to help Victoria as she struggled with her crutches and back brace, the very tools that allowed her to navigate the house. The physical pain was intense, but it was the emotional distance that hurt more. Every time she looked at Emile, she saw not a partner, but a man who was inconvenienced by her very existence. He didn't help her with the children, didn't offer a shoulder to cry on when the pain became too much. Victoria found herself relying more and more on her father and friends, leaning on them for the support that her husband refused to give. As the days wore on, Victoria couldn't ignore the nagging thoughts that plagued her every waking moment. She replayed the events of the jump over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of what had happened. The parachutes that failed, the twisted lines, the missing slink, all of it pointed to something more than just a tragic accident. And then there was Emile's behavior, the sudden urge to take her skydiving, his handling of her gear, the way he had pulled away from her when she needed him most. The realization hit her like a physical blow, worse than any of the injuries she had sustained in the fall. Emile had tried to kill her. The thought was too terrible to comprehend, but once it had taken root in her mind, it was impossible to shake. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had sabotaged her parachutes and left her to die. And now, in the cold light of day, she could see the truth in his eyes every time he looked at her with that distant, detached gaze. Victoria knew she had to find the strength to confront the truth, to face what Emile had done and take back control of her life. It wouldn't be easy. The road to recovery would be long and painful, and the emotional scars would take even longer to heal. But she was a survivor. She had fallen from the sky and lived, and she would not let Emile's betrayal break her. She would fight. She would heal. And one day, she would find the courage to tell the world her story, the story of a woman who had survived against all odds, and who had found the strength to stand tall once more, despite the man who had tried to take it all away. Victoria Cilliers' life had been a whirlwind of emotion since the terrifying day her parachutes failed, sending her plummeting towards what seemed like certain death. Miraculously, she survived the fall, but as she lay in the hospital bed, battered and broken, she clung to one thought: it had to be an accident. Even as investigators began to comb through the wreckage of her jump, piecing together the evidence, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But the idea that her husband, Emile, could have been involved, that was unthinkable. At first, Victoria's mind simply couldn't accept the possibility. Emile, the man she had married, the father of her children, couldn't possibly have tried to kill her. They'd had their issues. What couple didn't? But murder? She dismissed the investigators' probing questions and subtle hints as the wild speculation of people who didn't know him like she did. The suggestion that Emile might be responsible felt like a betrayal in itself, a painful twist of the knife in an already unbearable situation. But the police weren't so easily convinced. As they dug deeper, more and more unsettling details began to emerge. Emile's finances were in disarray. debts piling up, payments overdue. He had been living a life far beyond their means, and the noose of his financial irresponsibility was tightening. Then came the revelation that he had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Victoria just months before the jump. It was a classic motive, one that the police couldn't ignore. Victoria's world began to tilt. Each new piece of evidence chipped away at the foundation of trust she had built her life upon. The man she thought she knew, the man she had trusted with her life and her children, started to look like a stranger. But still, she clung to the hope that there was some other explanation, something that would make all of this make sense without shattering her world entirely. The day Emile was arrested was like a scene from a nightmare. Victoria had just finished feeding their youngest child when there was a knock at the door. She answered it, expecting nothing more than a routine visit from the police to update her on the investigation. But the look on the officers' faces said it all before they even spoke. "Mrs. Cilliers, we need to take Emile in for questioning." The words hit her like a physical blow. Victoria's knees buckled, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. Emile stood frozen, his usual confident demeanor replaced with something Victoria had never seen in him before: fear. The officers were firm but respectful as they explained that he was being arrested on suspicion of attempted murder. Victoria's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a mistake, some horrible misunderstanding. She tried to speak, to plead with the officers, but her voice wouldn't come. Emile said nothing as they placed him in handcuffs, his eyes avoiding hers. It was as if he had already resigned himself to his fate. As the door closed behind them, the silence that filled the house was suffocating. Victoria collapsed onto the floor, overwhelmed by a wave of emotion she couldn't control: shock, denial, confusion, and most of all, a deep, gnawing fear. What if they were right? What if the man she had loved, the man who had fathered her children, had truly tried to kill her? In the days that followed, the police revealed more of what they had uncovered. Emile's double life began to emerge like a dark, twisted thread woven through the fabric of their marriage. There were text messages to other women, including one particular affair that had continued right under Victoria's nose. Emile had been lying to her for years, deceiving her in ways she had never imagined. Each revelation was like a dagger to the heart. The man who had held her hand as she gave birth to their children, who had promised to love and protect her, was now exposed as a liar, a cheat, and possibly a murderer. The police laid out their case with chilling clarity. Emile had the knowledge, the motive, and the opportunity to sabotage Victoria's parachutes. For Victoria, the emotional toll was unbearable. She felt like she was unraveling, each new piece of information pulling her further away from the life she thought she knew. Friends and family reached out to offer support, but there was little they could do to ease the pain of such a profound betrayal. The man she had once shared her life with was now a stranger, and the only thing she knew for sure was that nothing would ever be the same again. Victoria's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of her still wanted to believe that Emile was innocent, that the man she had loved could not be capable of such a monstrous act. But as the evidence piled up, that part of her grew smaller and smaller, until all that was left was a hollow shell of disbelief and despair. The investigation had opened a wound that would never fully heal. The truth, when it finally came, was more devastating than she could have ever imagined. The life she had built with Emile, the future she had envisioned for her family, all of it was shattered. The only thing that remained was the stark, cold reality that the man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a monster she barely recognized. The courtroom was a cold, unfamiliar place, a stark contrast to the warmth and comfort Victoria Cilliers had once known. Now, this room, with its echoing footsteps and oppressive silence, would become the stage upon which her darkest fears were laid bare. She had survived the unimaginable, plummeting from the sky after both her parachutes failed, but now she faced a different kind of trial, one that demanded an emotional endurance she wasn't sure she possessed. Victoria entered the courtroom each day with the heavy knowledge that she would have to relive the trauma of her near-fatal fall, not just for herself, but for the jury, the press, and a public hungry for details. The prosecuting attorneys laid out their case with clinical precision, recounting Emile's financial troubles, his web of lies, and his tangled affairs. They painted a picture of a man driven to the brink by debts, desires, and desperation. At the center of his twisted plot was Victoria, the woman he had once sworn to love and protect. Testifying against Emile was the most harrowing experience of all. As she took the stand, Victoria could feel every eye in the room on her. The jury watched her intently, the press scribbled furiously, and Emile, cold, detached Emile, sat impassive. She recounted the events leading up to the fall, the conversations they had, and the moments that now seemed fraught with hidden meaning. Each word she spoke was a step back into the nightmare, a confrontation with the possibility that the man she had shared her life with had tried to end it. The prosecution meticulously built their case, presenting evidence of Emile's dire financial situation, debts mounting, creditors at the door, and the life insurance policy taken out on Victoria not long before the jump. Then there were the affairs, tawdry, humiliating betrayals that showed Emile's disregard for the marriage and for Victoria as a person. The affair with Stephanie Galler, in particular, was laid bare, revealing a man who was planning a future without Victoria, one that required her out of the picture. The defense sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, suggesting that the parachute failure could have been a tragic accident or the result of a mistake by someone else at the parachute center. But the defense's attempts to create reasonable doubt were up against the chilling logic of the prosecution's case. The picture they painted of Emile was devastating. Here was a man who knew how to pack a parachute, who had the opportunity to tamper with it, who had the motive of financial gain, and who had shown a callous disregard for his wife's life through his repeated infidelities. The pieces fit together too well to ignore. As the trial dragged on, the emotional toll on Victoria became increasingly evident. She was exhausted, drained from the constant reliving of her trauma, the media scrutiny, and the realization that her life was being picked apart in the most public way possible. But just as the trial seemed to be reaching its climax, everything came crashing down. The jury, after days of deliberation, was deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous decision. Accusations of bullying among jurors surfaced, and in the end, the judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. For Victoria, it was a devastating blow. Months later, the retrial began. This time, the atmosphere was different. The prosecution had strengthened their case, learning from the missteps of the first trial. They were determined to secure a conviction, and Victoria, despite the emotional toll, was equally determined to see justice served. The prosecution emphasized the cold, calculated nature of Emile's actions, the way he had handled Victoria's parachute the night before the jump, the way he had lied to her, to their children, to everyone. They highlighted the gas leak incident at the Cilliers' home, painting it as another attempt on Victoria's life, designed to look like a tragic accident. Victoria took the stand once more, her resolve steeled by the knowledge that this was her chance to finally put an end to the nightmare. She spoke with a quiet strength, recounting the events with the clarity that comes from having lived through them twice, once in the moment and once in the retelling. This was no longer just about what had happened to her. It was about ensuring that justice was done and that Emile could never hurt her or anyone else again. The defense tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case, but this time their arguments fell flat. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see it. Emile's motive, his actions, and his character all pointed to one conclusion: he was guilty. After weeks of testimony and cross-examinations, the jury returned with a verdict. Emile Cilliers was found guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder. The relief that washed over Victoria was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotions that she had kept in check for far too long. Emile was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison, a just punishment for the man who had tried to end her life. But as the reality of the verdict sank in, Victoria found herself grappling with mixed emotions. Yes, there was relief, and yes, there was a sense of justice served, but there was also heartbreak. This was the man she had once loved, the father of her children. The man who had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, who had taken everything from her, her trust, her sense of safety, her future. Even after Emile Cilliers was sentenced to life in prison, Victoria's ordeal was far from over. As she worked to rebuild her life and provide a stable environment for her children, she faced an unexpected and deeply unsettling new challenge: Emile's continuing attempts to exert control from behind bars. In a shocking turn of events, Victoria received legal demands from Emile's lawyers. Despite being convicted of attempting to murder her, Emile was now claiming that he was entitled to a share of the proceeds from the sale of her house. The house, which Victoria had purchased independently before their marriage, had been a sanctuary for her and her children, especially after the traumatic events she had endured. Emile's audacity in making this claim was staggering. It was a clear attempt to continue his manipulative and coercive behavior, using the legal system as a tool to harass and financially burden Victoria further. The fact that he would attempt to benefit financially from their marriage, even after being found guilty of trying to kill her, highlighted the depth of his callousness and greed. Despite the distress this situation caused, Victoria remained resolute. She vowed to fight Emile's claim with everything she had, determined not to let him continue to exert control over her life. For Victoria, this was not just about protecting her financial assets, it was about asserting her autonomy and refusing to allow Emile to victimize her any further. This new legal battle was yet another hurdle in Victoria's journey toward reclaiming her life, but it also served to strengthen her resolve. She had already survived the unimaginable, and she knew that she had the strength to overcome this challenge as well. As she prepared to face Emile in court once more, Victoria was more determined than ever to protect herself, her children, and the life she had fought so hard to rebuild. The decision to skydive again wasn't a sudden impulse for Victoria Cilliers. It was a deeply personal challenge, a way to confront the shadows of her past head-on. After years of enduring physical and emotional trauma, Victoria knew that she needed to reclaim control over her life, and that meant returning to the skies. It was a daunting proposition. The memories of that fateful day, the twisted parachute lines, the terrifying freefall, these were fears that had haunted her since the accident. But Victoria wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She was determined to turn this terrifying chapter into a triumphant victory. The idea first came to her during a conversation with a reporter shortly after Emile's conviction. The journalist asked a simple, almost offhand question: "Would you ever skydive again?" At that moment, Victoria felt a spark of defiance flicker to life within her. Why shouldn't she skydive again? Why should she allow fear planted by the man who had tried to destroy her, to dictate the rest of her life? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was something she needed to do, not just for herself, but as a statement to the world that she would not be defined by what had happened to her. Victoria decided that the jump would also serve a greater purpose. She would use the opportunity to raise funds for the Wiltshire Air Ambulance, the very service that had saved her life on that terrifying day. Turning her trauma into a force for good was not just empowering, it was a way to give back, to thank those who had been there for her in her darkest hour. However, organizing the jump was fraught with challenges. When she approached a local parachute center to plan the event, she was met with rejection. They feared the negative publicity that might come with hosting her, a stark reminder that even as she sought to reclaim her life, others still saw her as a potential liability. The rejection stung, but it also fueled her determination. Victoria wasn't just jumping for herself, she was jumping to prove a point. Undeterred, she sought out another parachute center and eventually found one willing to support her. With the plans in place, Victoria focused on preparing for the jump. But as the day approached, the old fears began to resurface. Memories of the failed parachutes, the out-of-control spin, and the looming ground plagued her nights. The anxiety was almost overwhelming, threatening to undo all the progress she had made. But Victoria knew that canceling the jump would mean surrendering to those fears, and that was something she could not allow. The day of the jump arrived, bringing with it a mixture of fear and anticipation. Surrounded by friends and supporters, Victoria tried to calm her nerves. This wasn't just another skydive, this was her declaration of survival, her refusal to be a victim any longer. As she suited up and boarded the plane, her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a reminder of the stakes. The plane climbed higher and higher, the ground below shrinking away until it was nothing more than a distant memory. The moment of truth arrived. As the door of the plane slid open, the rush of cold air hit her like a wave, snapping her back into the present. This was it. Victoria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She wasn't the same person who had made that fateful jump years ago. She was stronger now, more resilient. This time, she was in control. She stepped to the edge, her hands gripping the doorframe as she looked out into the void. The fear was still there, gnawing at her, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a challenge she was ready to face. With her instructor beside her, Victoria leapt from the plane. For a split second, time seemed to stand still, the world around her nothing but the rush of wind and the vast expanse of sky. And then the parachute deployed, perfectly, smoothly. There was no jolt of terror, no twisted lines. Just the sensation of slowing down, of the ground rising up to meet her in a controlled, gentle descent. The fear that had been a constant companion in her life for so long began to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of empowerment. She had done it. She had faced her demons and won. The landing was soft, and as her feet touched the ground, Victoria was overwhelmed with emotion. Tears streamed down her face, not of fear or pain, but of relief and triumph. The jump had been more than just a skydive. It had been a symbolic victory, a way of reclaiming her life from the clutches of fear and trauma. The sense of accomplishment was indescribable, and the knowledge that she had raised over £5,000 for the Wiltshire Air Ambulance only added to the satisfaction. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People were inspired by her courage, moved by her story of survival and resilience. For Victoria, this was the closure she had been searching for, the final step in putting the past behind her and moving forward with her life. With the jump behind her, Victoria turned her focus to the future. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but now they seemed surmountable. She embraced her role as a single mother with renewed energy, determined to create a stable and loving environment for her children. The nightmares that had once plagued her began to fade, replaced by dreams of a brighter, more hopeful future. Victoria also found a new sense of independence. No longer defined by her past, she began to explore new opportunities, new passions. She returned to work, found joy in the small moments with her children, and even opened herself up to the possibility of love again. The trauma she had endured had left scars, but it had also made her stronger, more determined to live her life on her own terms. In recent years, Victoria has found happiness in a new relationship. This new chapter in her life is marked by trust, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of the importance of moving forward without letting past traumas define the future. Her new partner has been a source of support and joy, helping her rediscover the possibility of love and companionship after everything she has been through. Together, they are building a life that is centered around healing, growth, and the happiness that Victoria has fought so hard to reclaim. In the years that followed, Victoria used her experience to inspire others. She became an advocate for victims of domestic abuse, sharing her story to raise awareness about the dangers of coercive control and the importance of seeking help. Her message was clear: survival is possible, and no one should have to live in fear. Victoria's journey is far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she feels like she is in control of her destiny. The sky, once a place of terror, has become her sanctuary again, a place where she can be free, where she can reclaim her life. And in that freedom, she has found the strength to move forward, leaving the past behind and embracing the possibilities of the future. The story of Victoria Cilliers is a harrowing narrative, one that resonates on many levels, deeply personal, profoundly human, and disturbingly universal. It is a tale that serves as both a chilling reminder and an inspiring testament to the indomitable spirit of survival. Victoria's journey from a passionate skydiver and devoted mother to a victim of one of the most cold-blooded murder plots ever attempted is nothing short of extraordinary. Her ability to withstand not only the physical trauma of a catastrophic parachute fall, but also the emotional devastation of betrayal by the person she trusted most, is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within us all. In the face of unimaginable adversity, Victoria's resilience shines as a beacon of hope and courage. But beyond the gripping details of this case lies a story that speaks to a much broader issue, one that affects countless lives in silence: the insidious nature of domestic abuse and the dangers of coercive control. Victoria's experience underscores the terrifying reality that abuse doesn't always leave visible scars. It can be subtle, manipulative, and all-consuming, eroding a person's sense of self and safety in ways that are often hidden from view. The case of Victoria Cilliers and the parachute murder plot is a stark reminder that domestic abuse can happen to anyone, anywhere, regardless of their background, profession, or status. It is a call to action, urging us all to be more vigilant in recognizing the signs of coercive control and emotional manipulation, both in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. Victoria's story is not just one of survival, it is a call to action. It challenges us to speak out, to offer support, and to take a stand against the hidden dangers that lurk behind closed doors. It is a powerful reminder that we must do more to protect the vulnerable, to educate ourselves and others about the warning signs of abuse, and to ensure that help is available for those who need it. As we close the chapter on Victoria's story, we are left with a profound sense of respect for her courage and a renewed commitment to raising awareness about domestic abuse. Victoria's journey from victim to survivor is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for resilience, and it serves as an inspiration to us all. If you've listened up to this point, please leave a comment saying, "Done," and we'll personally thank you for your support. Thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into the case of Victoria Cilliers and the parachute murder attempt. We hope you found this episode as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did while creating it. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this case? Was justice served? Share your opinions in the comments below. In our research for this episode, we read, "I survived. I married a charming man, then he tried to kill me," a true story by Victoria Cilliers herself. If you're interested in diving even deeper into this case, we've included an Amazon affiliate link in the description box. Purchasing through that link won't cost you anything extra, but it will help support our channel. And if you're hungry for more content, consider joining our Patreon community. There you'll find over 1,000 pages of news coverage on this case, 45 minutes of news clippings and court documents, and you can even purchase the entire set of images featured in this episode through our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.